This is Bob Greenberg, and you are watching the Break It Down Show.
One of our very first guests was Dr. Robert Greenberg, Dr. Bob, as we call him, someone that I love dearly. I love your work, and it's always great to have you back on the show. This must be your sixth or seventh. I mean, we have done a lot of work, you and I.
Yes, we
My
have.
dad passed, your dad passed. We've talked about everything. It's incredible that we've got this multi-year friendship because of the show.
Yes, we do. And we would have done more of them had not this darned pandemic gotten in our way.
Yeah, because normally we'd be having some martinis, even at noon. That's fine.
Well, not for me. I'm good. I can have a nice drink after 5 o'clock or so. But if I do it before then, I'm just a basket case. I'm definitely, my core temperature has to be in full afternoon heat. What can I say,
Yes.
Pete? I'm a
full afternoon lather before you start drinking.
Don't you know it?
Well, that's why God invented Brandy Alexander's, just a little more gentle on the ride.
I see. Get you in slowly. I've missed you, dude.
Same. And John's going to pop in here in a second. As you know,
Okay.
he gets busy helping people recreate their homes. And so that is what he's doing right now. But he'll be here in a moment.
Bless him that he's
How have
still
you
in
been?
Business. Oh,
Yeah,
crazy. You know, like everybody else, just trying to negotiate a reality that none of us want to have to deal with. It's been hard. You know, I have 2 grown-up kids. I have a grandchild now, and I have 2 young kids. My daughter turned 14 today, and my son's about to turn 12. They've been home nonstop since March 16th. They're in school right now on Zoom. So, you know, what used to be my privacy is totally gone, and all my gigs have disappeared. But given what's happening to a lot of people, I'm as lucky as they get because, you know, here we are. We're intact. We're not sick, and economically we're doing okay. My heart just goes out to everybody. I mean, did you have an experience? Am I to understand you something happened in your family?
Yeah, I mean, it's my girlfriend's son had it, and so right here. But he was young, and if he didn't spend a lot of hours on the couch watching TV, we might have been worried about him. But
Got it.
you know, so yes, it's important to acknowledge how dangerous it is, and I don't know how I've not gotten it. I've been so active around so many different people, you know, but and sometimes by choice and sometimes just by happenstance early on. We went to New York City right as they were closing things down. You know, like a week later, everything shut. The travel ban out of Italy had started. Our waitress she's Italian. She just got back from Rome, you know, and serving us food. And all they did was take her temperature and go, it's okay. Go back home. So you know, and we didn't get sick. And we did, you know, it's New York, buses, trains, taxis, everything. We did all of that stuff. We went to the 9/11 museum, you know, in like I think March 10th or something like that. And we, you know, we managed to dodge it, which hopefully that remains the truth. But yeah, it's been crazy. It's hard to understand.
It is. It's just, you know, I work at home. So I have to say certain aspects of my life haven't changed at all. I've got my workspace right here. I'm accustomed to being behind a computer. So that's offered no disruption to me. The cancellation of the gigs, okay. So I'm working that much harder on Patreon, and I'm doing a lot of blogging and vlogging and so forth. But it's after all of this time, I think we're all fatigued by it. We're all fatigued by it, and you know, I'm writing music, which is good. I'm not going away at all. I'm used to traveling 100,000 miles a year. That's not happening.
Right.
But it's just we're all hurting because none of us is living our lives the way we would like to live them and the way we're accustomed to living them. So it's tough. It's tough. But here we are. Here we are, intact.
And that shirt is
a good
glorious.
time with
That shirt is
Well,
beautiful.
you know, I have to tell you, I had a gig this morning. I do this this thing with a bunch of people in Vienna, Austria. And one of the people, his name is Niels Moos. He's a opera professor at Vienna City College. And he always wears these incredibly colorful shirts. And I'm used to wearing, my ninja black, my musician thing, so you can fade into the night as the
Sideman
tomatoes.
black.
Right. Well, to me, it's pure defensive. It's in anticipation of the tomatoes and the cabbage that I figure I can just fade into the shadows.
How long has it been since a musician has had cabbage or tomatoes thrown at them, Dr. Bob? You're the historian.
I think
What's the
about, the COVID lockdown started on March 16th here in the Bay Area. So I would say March 15th. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And you're
They
looking
still
at
have bands
okay?
at farmers markets,
Yeah. So, but Niels wears these very colorful shirts. So I decided, you know what? I'm tired of being upstaged by this Viennese professor. So I wore this today, and he was like,
nicely done.
exactly. So I figured I'd wear it for us too,
I like it. It's festive.
Yeah.
It is, and I'm not a festive person generally. I'm a dour, unhappy person. So
Have us fooled.
So yeah, well, I put on a great show. I put on an act. But the shirt, I feel the shirt bleeding into my body now, raising my spirits.
Good. This is one of the things too that I think we've all learned is that it's time for things like, hey, I'm going to grab my musical pen and write some music, or I'm just going to pause and take things a little bit slower because there's less urgency to get everything off your plate every day. I mean, imagine these kids having to, and this is what I want to transition into. Like, you have taught over the internet for years, but really it's more like via distance, so, and what you do is different. Can you imagine doing chemistry lab over Zoom,
No.
or teaching calculus over Zoom? And it just.
No. And this is what my kids are doing. I mean, it's not calculus and chemistry, but my 14-year-old is in 8th grade and she's doing serious stuff. I think what's so exhausting about it, because I'm doing a good bit of Zoom lecturing. I mean, yesterday I had to record a 2-hour lecture. When you're working in front of kids, if you're in a classroom, if you're in a theater, you got people in front of you and you draw energy from that environment. But there's no energy to draw. I mean, we're talking now, but if it's just you, there's no energy to draw over Zoom. It's exhausting. It's exhausting. And I would have understood that intellectually, but now I understand it physically and emotionally in a way that I never would have before the lockdown. It's really hard to teach this way without the feedback, without the instant feedback you get from being in front of people. So no, I can't imagine having to teach that way, but I can imagine having to learn that way because that's what the kids are having to deal with. And they're not doing great. I have straight A students who are not getting straight A's now.
Yeah, it's completely understandable. And if I was a teacher, I'd be like, hey, guess what everybody gets this quarter or semester? Right. Everybody gets an A because nobody knows how to do this. So you're all getting 25% extra credit plus some more if you need it. It's like, let's just. And then what does that mean for like everybody who's in education, like right now, their development, like, okay, teachers, you're stuck with this model. We're going to do more of this. Hey, kids who didn't master the lessons of Calculus 1 or whatever it's going to be, you're going to have to rehash this stuff and you're going to have time for the foreseeable future. Yeah. We're going to have to do this.
Again, luckily for my kids, 12 and 14, they're not in pivotal years. They're not a senior in high school. Right. They're not a freshman in college. But for kids that are in those transitional years, this is a small disaster because not only are they not learning, but they're not transitioning into adulthood the way they could be, should be, and deserve to be. I have a friend named Mark Zitter, and his daughter graduated from high school in June, and his son graduated from Brown University in June, and they graduated both sitting at home in Oakland, California. And what a ripoff! What a ripoff! Yeah. They should be out partying with their friends and enjoying these age-appropriate celebrations. So those are the kids I really feel badly for.
I think there is going to be a hiccup, intellectually speaking, in the flow of humanity that happens because of this, and hopefully it's not one that's because of a prolonged because we've gone at it long enough, and hopefully we can crawl out of this, without being too damaged relatively. But I do think that there's going to be a bit of a misstep. There is going to be a generation that didn't quite get something,
Mm-hmm.
and we're going to feel it a little later.
It'll be real, it's going to be really interesting, John, because since we're still in the middle of it, and since we're still adapting as best as we can to it, we have no perspective on what we're really going through right now as a society, as a global population, really.
Yeah.
That's only going to become apparent 5 years down the road, if the businesses that are going out of business now, if those storefronts are still blank, if those restaurants are still gone. We can't really know how it's going to play out spiritually and economically while we're in the middle of it. But in 5 or 10 years, it'll be interesting. We'll talk about the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully there won't be another one to be talking about.
Yeah.
Because the circumstances that brought this one about have not changed at all. They still have those live animal marts in China, and, people, increasingly human beings, are living places they shouldn't live, in proximity to wildlife they shouldn't be in proximity to. So it remains to be seen, but I think your point is really interesting. We just don't know yet.
Let's talk about the effect on creativity. What do you think this is going to do for a generation of musical creators? And the hunkering down has got pluses and minuses. How do you think this plays out?
Well, it's going to affect a lot of people, but in a lot of different ways. I can speak for myself, for example. It's given me more time to write, and I'm actually writing, and that's the one good thing for me that I'm doing right now. I'm composing, and even though I can't get that music performed, I can upload it. I can do a very good digital recording, and I can upload it, for example, for my Patreon people. I've got about 550 followers now, and so I'm actually concertizing, at least electronically. But the disaster will be if the public becomes accustomed to taking in their music on the internet.
Yeah.
This is what every performing artist is worried about. It's what every performing arts organization is panicked about. And that is, how do we get people to sit back down in proximity to each other in a concert hall if they have spent the last 3 years becoming accustomed to consuming music this way? And for those who say, well, what's the big deal? My response is, the big deal is, first of all, nothing can ever replace live performances, because performers need an audience. You see, you can't make the music without an audience, without that feedback that we were just talking about. You can't do it. You can't sit in an empty room and play a Beethoven sonata and sell it the way you can if you've got a real live audience. And that's true with rockers. It's true with jazzers. It's true with anybody. The studio cannot replace the stage. And this is very hard on performing musicians. I do these shows every week with these performing musicians, these shows in Vienna. And to a person, they'll tell you the same thing. I'm depressed. I don't want to practice. I have nothing to practice for. Sure, so I'm going to sit down and learn another piece. Why? Who am I going to play it for? They are dependent on their audience.
Yeah.
And it's really hard on them psychologically. So I don't know how this is going to play out, John. In terms of creativity, well, I don't think that's a problem, because ultimately we all create probably by ourselves, unless you're an improvising musician. We're accustomed to making the music by ourselves, but performing it's a whole different story. And I don't know how it's going to play out. What do you think?
There's a
I'm
communication
curious.
in performance, give and take, whether it's jazz or, the audience and the performer. I mean, you think about when a performer, like a lead man or a lead lady, we just had Susie Quattro on the show the other day. You don't get more iconic and legendary than her, but she doesn't do this because she just loves playing the bass and wants to sing songs. She does it because of that audience interaction. They love her, she loves them, and they communicate non-verbally in this way that it just, you go into the Forum, or you go into the Hollywood Bowl, or you go into whatever place it is, the Greek in Berkeley, and everybody's standing up, waving their arms, singing their hearts out. When you go to church, and you're singing, and you're praising God in your way of doing it. It doesn't work over the internet like that.
No,
No one says I felt the spirit move me. I put my hands up right now talking to you guys. I love you guys, but I'd rather be with you.
We spent 200,000 years evolving our species, the Cro-Magnon, as a tribal species. And now for the last 6 months, the tribal aspect is gone. Or someone could say, since the invention of the internet, we've been becoming less tribal. But you can't undo our hardwiring. In a couple of years, we are better as a group. We're smarter as a group. We are accustomed to reacting to stimulus as a group. It makes us smarter and stronger, more intelligent. And we can't forget that. Live performance, religious gatherings, sports gatherings, that's what it's all about. It's about the environment. It's about the reinforcing aspects of lots of people experiencing the same shit at the same time.
Yeah.
And that's what's hurting musicians right now, right? I mean, someone who performs for a living is crazy because it's a terrible way of making a living. You do it because of the thrill. You do it because of that connection. And it is a thrill, and it is an amazing connection. So I think it's really hard on performers right now. Really hard on performers.
I think ultimately the communal experience will win and it'll come back, but it is a rough time, and it's a rough time for everybody emotionally who likes to enjoy live music. And we talk about the players. The most obvious thing to us is the effect on the players because we're players. But there's also a whole lot of folks who make their living rigging lights and building stages, and all of those nice folks are having a really hard time right now too.
If you are a union member, at least, you have some hopes of getting unemployment. But if you're a performer, an independent performer, you're self-employed. There's no unemployment checks for us. Because we don't, unless you're a union member. But this is another hard thing about performers right now. If you're not a teacher, if you're an independent like I am, you can't get unemployment. There's no way you can cover yourself financially. And that's another thing that makes it difficult. But you're absolutely right. The entire structure of the performing arts, to say nothing for the structure of athletics, and so forth. I mean, there's so many hoteliers and restaurateurs, and I mean, these are huge interdependent structures. And the performing arts, the athletics, which I see as a performing art, by the way.
Yeah,
it's
sure.
It's crazy. It's crazy that they're allowing college people to play football now, but there's so much money involved. There's such a huge structure involved that folks are more concerned about the income than the health of the players. But that's nothing new either. It's just we'll see where it settles out. You know what I'm interested in, and I would love your guys' opinions on this. What kind of literature is going to come out of this? What's this doing to the writers who are isolated while they write, but who need to be out and about in order to gather the energy that they use to write with? What kind of literature is going to be written during the pandemic? Because we don't know yet. It takes time to write a book. It takes time to get a book published. And how will this affect the literary community? Have you interviewed anybody? Have you gotten any feedback on that?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have. And it's more of the same thing. There's some that are like depressed and kind of slogging along as best they can. Some that are like, I'm just shutting it all down for right now, because why am I going to kill myself doing this?
Right.
But there's also people, Chris Thomas King. He's like, I'm going to be in my studio anyhow. I already work by myself a lot of the year. So I didn't have an album planned, but guess what's going to happen? And he did this album. And so I think it's a mix of all of these things. And,
right.
And this goes towards your recent course that you wrote about, music and history and how they work together and they form each other. I think, down the road, we're going to see whether and it won't just be social justice. It'll be all of it, just whatever kind of hardship that we're going through, but also the beautiful stories of people pivoting and adapting and thriving. because there's definitely good things that have come out of this. It's as hard as that is to believe. We've talked to people like that too, where they've pivoted and said, I'm doing great. I'm as busy as I've ever been. I'm more creative than I've ever been. So, for me, from the podcast side, from what I've talked to people,
right,
it's a mix.
I think there's a level of depression that's going to be evident in the works that come out of this time period. While some people are prospering, I think that in general are having to deal with this is going to lead to just a bunch of content that's got a different mood than before it and after it.
Yeah. And to what degree is that mood going to be escapist? Like I'm going to try to elevate my own mood by pretending this isn't happening, and by finding something positive to write about. Who the heck knows? It's always interesting.
Is there a general sense for the literature that came out of the Depression that way? If we look at the writers that wrote in the midst of the Great Depression, did that change moods in a demonstrable fashion?
I can't, since I'm not a literature person, any way I would address that would be simply as an observer, as a casual, anecdotal observer. But I can address what happened after World War I and World War II in music and composed music, because the reactions were just so different. I mean, World War I, the first industrial scale war, where I think something like 90% of the casualties were inflicted by artillery. You never saw what killed you.
Wow.
It was but fought with cavalry techniques that went back 100 years. So you'd put 20,000 men out in the field and have them run across the field and get cut to pieces by machine guns and artillery. It was a time when many people felt civility and civilization had ended, and we were reverting to a barbaric, pre-civilized atmosphere. Not a lot of music was written during the war because people were called up. Composers were called up into the military. But afterwards, it's interesting, the reaction. On one hand, you had this extremely conservative reaction in 1919, 1920, 1921. Composers like Stravinsky writing music that sounds like faux Mozart, faux Bach, an attempt to recapture civility, to recapture something of common experience, a turn away from modernism entirely. The kind of modernism that predated the war was left behind, and instead was this kind of nostalgic search for human goodness. After World War II, the cutting edge composers went the absolute opposite direction. They reverted to the most highly intellectualized music ever composed, music composed via formula. The young composers of the time generally believed that the disaster, the catastrophe of fascism and Nazism had been created by nationalism and this mythical feeling of the people, the Volk. They believed that the catastrophe had been caused by Romanticism, which emphasized feeling over reason. So we have to purge ourselves musically of all that crap. We've got to write music that's based on intellect and formula, music devoid of feeling, music devoid of nationalism. And some of that music written after World War II, for the 10 years after World War II, from 45 to 55 or so, it's the nastiest, ugliest, most unlistenable stuff in the world. But a lot of young artists felt the need to purge themselves of all the cluttered accoutrement that they believed had caused the war. So is it an interesting World War I? Cutting edge is suddenly incredibly traditional. World War II, afterwards, cutting edge, incredibly modernistic. So we'll see. We'll see how this experience affects or doesn't affect the kind of music and literature that comes out of it.
That's
a great answer.
Yeah. There are so many eras that things like this have happened in the past, whether it was financial crises or other pandemics and everything. Do you feel like there's a mode that matches pandemics versus a depression, like I don't know, the panic of 1866 or something like that, where markets crashed? Is that a different kind of music?
I don't think so. I think a market crash, for example, we could talk about 2008. I think a market crash like that, even the Depression, well, actually, the Depression was different because the government began funding the arts in order to spread the money around. And the government during the Depression in the United States wanted music that could be listened to by everybody. So we had a very nationalistic period, the music of Aaron Copland, like Appalachian Spring and Rodeo, and lots of other composers were writing music based on American folk music. So there's an example where a Depression did alter somewhat the musical language. But I don't think a small event like 2008 or 1866 or whatever you mentioned just now, I don't think a small event has that power. The last big pandemic in 1918 and 1919, following exactly on the heels of World War I, however, in fact, killed way more people than the war had killed, and the war killed millions. That doubled down the sense of disaster, the sense that the world was just ending. And I think the reactions after World War I were also reactions to the pandemic. But I think you need to have a pretty damned amazing disaster to globally affect the arts in a way that's perceivable. And a world war is about as disastrous an event as you can possibly come up with.
What would it take for... No, I don't want to ask that way. Do you think this is that type of an event?
I don't.
And then the follow-up is, how much longer before it becomes one?
Well, I don't think it's going to become one, because by this time next year, we should be talking about whether we have gotten our inoculations or not. We will have a vaccine sometime next year. And the people I know and talk to, all right, we're looking at 2022 for a return to the concert hall, to a return to semi-normalcy. And unlike 1918, 1919, we do have Zoom. We do have the internet. We can communicate. We're not cut off from each other the way they were 100 years ago. Oh my goodness, can you imagine? If we were offline right now, that would be a disaster. But
we wouldn't get to see that shirt.
I wouldn't get to wear it, man.
Right.
Yeah, Bob doesn't wear a shirt at home. It's all skins around there. You know that, John.
Well, I wear the shirt, but you don't know what's going down underneath, do you?
By the way, one of the positives of COVID is, John grabbed the drumsticks again a few years back, and it has taken and it's survived through COVID. And look at that glorious hair.
I know. I was going to say, dude.
It's a positive all the way through.
Maybe. We have to talk to John's wife about that, though,
Oh, she's into it more than I am.
She
loves it.
Yeah.
I always think it's dangerous when the guy has better looking hair than your wife. The advice I gave my older daughter, who's 34 now, when she was a teenager, she didn't want it, but I was giving it to her anyway. Never date a guy who spends more on clothing than you do. And never date a guy who's got better hair than you, spends more time on his hair than you do. Because it's a bad sign. I know it's sexist, but it's a bad sign all the way around. Oh, and never date anyone whose saliva doesn't run clear.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those are all good pieces of advice. That last one, I would say, if you could see the saliva often enough to know whether or not it runs clear.
It's also bad, right? Exactly. Yeah.
Hey, let me ask you a music question. Sorry, did I cut you off, John?
No, please.
Okay. So last week we lost Eddie Van Halen, and one of the questions that immediately hit me was, when he pops through the pearly gates, is J.S. Bach there going, I can't wait to jam with you, or is he like, you owe me so much money? Like which one?
You know what? I don't believe in the pearly gates. Let's just start with an assumption. I don't think Bach has been listening to a lot of Eddie Van Halen. I don't think Eddie Van Halen was listening to a lot of Bach. So they could pass each other on the pearly streets, and I think not even recognize each other. That's the best I could do with that one, Pete. It's they're so foreign from each other. I mean, if there is such a thing as an afterlife, and if someone like Bach, with his musical language, had to witness what's happened since then, he might as well be in hell, for God's sake. You know, I mean, think about it. Bach, with his amazing sophistication and intellectualization and total control over his materials, and now he's having to listen to some of the stuff that was created after World War II, for example. I think he would say, "I'd rather lose my hearing." You know, what has happened to this world? I don't think they could make that transition.
Wow.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I
Ouch.
don't think they could make that transition. I think if I'm going to develop an idea that I don't believe in, there's a special heaven for rockers. There's a special heaven for jazzers. There's a special heaven for dead, bewigged composers. And part of that heaven is they don't have to go outside their comfort zone for eternity. So otherwise, what's the point in being in paradise if you always have to go outside your comfort zone? I mean, my paradise would be a place where I could finally chill a bit, you know, take the pressure off, put up my dogs, you know, have a drink before 5.
Yeah. And you never have to hear a band play, hey, here's another one off our new album.
Right. You never have to have someone come up to you while you're playing the piano and say, "Hey man, can you play like the theme from The Sting or 2001 or Brian's song?"
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think he liked Hooked on Classics?
Bach?
Yeah.
I don't even think he would like the piano.
Oh wow, really?
You know, yet
Wow.
the Moog synthesizer. Yeah. He had the opportunity to play some early pianos built by a guy named Gottfried Silbermann, who was so famous for his pianos in Germany that a lot of people early on credited him with having invented the darn thing. It wasn't invented by him. It was invented by an Italian back in the late 1600s named Cristofori. But Bach played Silbermann's pianos and just basically said, "Okay, it's a nice toy. I'm going home to my organ." And so again, you know, it is interesting. We look at these world figures like Bach or any great creator, and we would think that they would be, you know, we would hope they would be flexible in their hearing, but I somehow doubt it. How do you lift someone out of their time? I mean, how would you lift us out of our time if we were suddenly exposed to a culture in 250 years? Could we appreciate that at all? Or would we say that's utterly out of my life and experience? And that really seems awful to me. I mean, we might be fascinated by the technology, but I wonder if I could in any way adapt to the music of 250 years from today.
Well,
Wow.
even going the other direction, if you were to go back in time to Bach's era, 270 years, well, we'll give him some lifetime, 265 years back, we would be so busy trying to stay alive. You know, there's all this on-demand luxury we have now. You know, I don't know how people got any creative work done back then. I mean, how did they do it? It was so much harder to stay alive back then.
It was, but if you were part of a community, there were so many fewer distractions. I mean, let's face it, you got up with the sun, generally speaking. You went to bed when the sun went down, generally speaking. I mean, you could light a candle, but you can't do a whole lot by candlelight. But they had no freaking distractions. They weren't checking CNN every day. They weren't checking their email or their posts. They weren't reading international newspapers. They had a lot more time to sit still and to think and to do their creative work. So in some ways, if you were part of a community, if you were gainfully employed, I think that slower way of life was in many ways a more humane way of life. Okay, if you're living on a farm and trying to scratch out an existence from the earth, that's a different story. But if you were in a city and you were of the middle class, it would be interesting. It would be interesting. I think if any of us went back in time, that amount of time, we would go mad from the lack of stimulus. Seriously, you know, we are used to stimulant. We're used to being stimulated all the time.
All the time.
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah. I went on vacation over the weekend. I've been gone for 4 days, and a lot of that was unplugging from the stimulus, and it was great, but you know, it would be maddening. But one of the things that I happened to go away with somebody else who was a big fan of Miles Davis, and so we drifted into that conversation. And I'm just using that as a way to transition into a topic for our listeners who are not familiar with your earlier episodes, because we bring you on as our resident expert on literate music and music juxtaposed upon history. But another thing I want to punctuate that we know about you is that you were a piano teacher for Tony Williams. And so I don't have a question. I just wanted to bring that up for the listeners.
Composition teacher.
A composition teacher. Okay.
Composition teacher. Yeah.
Well, yeah. That may be even better. So you taught composition to the great drummer Tony Williams.
Right.
There, I've said the words. Do you have any interesting Tony Williams stories that unfolded from that relationship?
Did I ever tell you the story about how I met him?
No.
Oh, it's a great story. So I was living in this terrible little bullshit apartment in Berkeley. I was a grad student, like a second year grad student. So this would have been 79, 80. And I was doing a lot of teaching at the time. I taught high school before I was a grad student, so I was a good teacher. And the department was giving my name out when people would call and say, I want piano lessons, I want composition lessons. So I was one of the names that was given out. So I get a call one day from this guy who had called the music department looking for a composition teacher. He introduces himself as Anthony, and he wants to take composition lessons. And I say, well, what do you want? He goes, well, I want the equivalent of a college music education. I said, what's your background? Do you have? I've done some playing. I've written a few things. But I'm really serious about this. I said, well, listen, let's get together. Let's have a lesson. And we'll see if I'm right for you.
Tell us again what year this was.
79, I think. Either 79. Yeah, it would have been 79 because I was living on Ellsworth Street in Berkeley.
79. So by then he had maybe a dozen albums under his belt as a band leader. Never mind as a band leader. As a band leader.
Right. He was recording for Blue Note at the time. And so the appointed day comes, and I hear this deep rumbling, and everything in my tiny little apartment is shaking. It was one of these brown shingle houses turned into an apartment, a group of apartments. I look outside. His Ferrari has just pulled up under my window, and the place is shaking from the engine. And this elegantly dressed man, let that plane go over.
Yeah, no kidding. I'm going to mute it right now.
This elegantly dressed man gets out of the Ferrari, shuts it down. Now, right across the street was a package store. And always sitting on the steps were these guys who were, buying whatever Thunderbird they could drink, for $1. And there were a couple of them sitting on the steps. So this guy gets out of his car, looks at them, walks over to them, has a conversation with them. I see him pull out his wallet and hand each one of them a bill. It turns out that he thought they might not be friendly towards his car, so he decided to take the positive tack. It turns out he went over him and said, hey, I want you guys to keep an eye on my wheels. Here's $5 for each of you. Here's another $5 when I come out of here in an hour. Make sure the kids stay away from my car. Smartest thing I ever saw anyone do.
Yes.
So anyway, he comes up and very articulate, intelligent. We talk about a course of study. We talk about a course of study that we meet twice a week for like 4 years. He says, I'm fine with that. I name my price. I'm fine with that. And so he gets out his checkbook. We have a lesson. I still don't know who he is. He pulls out his checkbook to write me the check for the first month because I charged by the month. That way, if you don't show up, I don't pay for it.
Right.
And he hands me the check and it says Anthony Williams. And I hadn't really caught the last name. I look at him, I say, what do you do for a living? He goes, I play some drums. I said, fuck. I said, you're Tony Williams, man. I mean, it's like, boom, it just hit me. You're Tony Williams, man. I've been listening to you since I was 12, man. He says, don't embarrass me. Just don't embarrass me. I said, I'm not embarrassed. I'm freaked. I was freaked. He was so smooth. You'd never, he didn't want to talk about it. He didn't want me to have any preconceived notions about him. Of course, I knew who he was. I'd been listening to Miles Davis since I was a kid. And it was the 7 Steps to Heaven album that I got when I was 12, which was the first album I got with Tony Williams on it. And, you know, he played the drums like it was an orchestra. And you couldn't help but hear that. He wasn't a drummer. He was an orchestrator who happened to use a trap set, a big trap set.
Right.
So I was blindsided, totally blindsided. And he preferred not to talk about it. I mean, we worked together for 6 years, 7 years. So over that time, of course, we talked about it a lot. Mm-hmm. But he was embarrassed almost by his notoriety. He was embarrassed by what he didn't know because, you know, he went on the road with Miles when he was 16. He never finished high school. He never had a music education per se. He played drums, and he was embarrassed by that. And he wanted a full intellectual, aesthetic knowledge of music. He didn't want to be a drummer. He wanted to be a complete musician. And he was. By the time he finished with me, I mean, he was already a great musician, but by the time he finished with me, he did have that equivalent of a college music education.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. And he went back out and paid those guys another $5 or whatever it was.
Those guys made money about 2 or 3 times a month, huh?
Yeah, 2 times a month.
That's terrific.
No, 2 times a week, excuse me.
Twice a week.
Oh, wow.
Twice a week. Well, you know what? I have to say, he started driving his BMW, his white BMW to my place.
He knew he was going to visit you in the slums.
Exactly. He's smartened up. You can't take your Ferrari just anywhere. It's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
Where did he live at the time? He lived in Oakland, I think?
No, he lived in San Anselmo. In
San Anselmo.
In Marin County. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, no.
And he was driving to Berkeley to come see you.
He loved driving, and he drove way too fast. And he loved his cigars, and he smoked his cigars when he was in the car because his girlfriend hated him. So that gave him a chance to smoke too.
Okay.
Those are
neat things to learn about Tony Williams.
Well, when he wasn't on tour, he had nothing else to do. Yeah. Again, it's interesting. I'd never met someone that high up in the jazz world.
There aren't that many people that high up in the jazz world.
No, there aren't. And he had gotten to the point. He had a recording band, but he didn't have a touring band. When he toured, his touring is what made him his money. He toured with Herbie Hancock and well, right out of my head, the bass player,
Ron Carter.
Ron Carter, thank you. He toured with, as he says, Herbie and Ron. And it was a JATP, the Jazz at the Philharmonic, and Norman Granz was their agent. And they would, they'd go to Japan for 6 weeks, and then they'd go to South Korea for 4 weeks, and that would be it for the year. And he'd make his $300K or whatever it was. It was a lot of money at the time. But then he had 8 months to crap around with, to spend his money and to crap around. And so, he didn't mind driving from Marin County to Berkeley because he didn't have anything else to do. Mm-hmm. I envied him that amount of time. I still do. Can you imagine only having to work 3 or 4 months a year and then being able to kick back? Wow.
Yeah, I don't think that's the greatest thing I would imagine about being Tony Williams.
Well, it was to the degree that, he wanted to pursue this education with me. He had all the time in the world to pursue it. That's why he was able to see me twice a week. And he threw himself into it. And he did great, by the way. He did great.
Oh, I imagine.
So
I mean, he was an achiever for sure.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And he was an achiever with a chip on his shoulder, an achiever who felt inadequate around people like Herbie and Ron, who could talk about harmony, who could talk about bass lines, who could talk about musical structure and form, and he felt he couldn't. Yeah. And he wanted to be writing more music, and he didn't feel he had the tools to be writing more music. And he got them.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Last January, we bumped into Herbie Hancock very briefly. Not enough time, not the right place to say, "Hey, Herbie, do you think we can get a picture?"
Oh,
or anything more. Actually, he had just given the greatest tribute I had heard a human being give another artist about Joni Mitchell. and he presented her with her Tech Lifetime Achievement Award or Hall of Fame Award. And when he did it, he started off with the teleprompter, and then he just went off script. And he went on for a good probably 20 minutes, you think, Pete? Where he just went, Joni went, and he went through her album chronology and how each one affected him and how each one led to the other and the artistic movement from one to the next. And I mean, you could tell he was so familiar with her body of work and truly loved her. So when we bumped into him, all I could say was, you know, thank you for giving us that and for being the right person for Joni right then.
Right.
And he thanked me back, and then we parted ways. But I thought to myself, there are maybe 4 or 5 people in the universe that I would consider would make me feel the same about that meeting. And one of them would have been Tony Williams. So just the humanity of, you know, how much he enjoyed studying from you, how much he got from it. I totally can relate to that, but the feeling of inadequacy and a guy like that having a chip on his shoulder from that inadequacy sometimes makes him such a great artist. He
told me this story. When I was 18 or 19, I sought out improvisation lessons with the alto saxophonist Lee Konitz. I was living I was in school in New Jersey, so once a week I'd take the bus to New York City and we'd have a lesson. And Lee Konitz's teacher, Lenny Tristano, a real hero of mine, a pianist, an amazing pianist. And despite the fact that I'm not a saxophone player, just a piano player, the lessons with Konitz were key to my development because he taught me how to listen to myself. He taught me how to hear what I was doing and to react to what I was doing in a kind of consistent way. He changed my life. But anyway, he was really into, at the time, he was making these 4 saxophone recordings of Bartok and of Bach. And apparently Tony ran into Lee Konitz at an airport, and they said hi, and Lee says to Tony, "So what you doing?" He goes, "Well, I'm taking composition lessons." He goes, "Oh, are you finally learning about invertible counterpoint?" He just threw out a line like that Tony didn't know at the time, but he just threw out a line just to fuck with him. And Tony was so pissed off. That was the crap he hated. That was because he was a drummer. He was a drummer, and that's how drummers are treated. And like they're, you know, that's the old joke. What do you call a guy who hangs out with musicians? A drummer. A drummer, right. What do you call a drummer without a girlfriend? Homeless. How do you get a drummer to climb up on the roof? You tell him the drinks around the house. You know, this is talk about no respect. No respect whatsoever.
Yeah, I do resemble some of those remarks, though.
I imagine so. But
hey, let's talk a little bit about what you're doing, because first off, if anybody who doesn't know who Dr. Bob is already, that's fine. We'll get you caught up. Stop messing around. Go to robertgreenbergmusic.com and start to learn about literate music history and all these things. You know, we
Sign
like
up
to
for
say
Music
we used to
History
like
Mondays. Sign up for everything.
We used to like to say that you were the Neil deGrasse Tyson of literate music, but then we realized Neil deGrasse Tyson is the Robert Greenberg.
Thank you.
It's like,
thank you. He's
the other way around.
Dude. He's the young dude. Exactly.
He's the young guy, and you have been doing this for a long time, and you've given me personally so much knowledge about opera, about Mozart, about Bach, all these different things in a way that is completely. It's so wonderful to hear you tell these stories. It's why we first pursued you. You know, I told you I would listen to your lectures, you know, in Iraq and in Iraq, and it would just take me away from what I was doing, and they'd give me the opportunity to go listen to something. My dad was a musical person, and he would play all this stuff in the house, but I couldn't make hide nor hair of it because no one ever explained it. And so that's what Dr. Bob does, and I give it 100% backing. If you guys like what I like, you'll like this for sure.
You know, we don't need people. I mean, it's nice to hear contemporary music, whatever the contemporary music is, explained to us by the creators. But generally, we don't need someone to explain the context of rock and roll. We don't need someone to explain the context of hip hop because we're living it. We get it. It's part of our culture. We see where it comes from and we understand what it means because it's part of our lives. Well, we need to know that same bit about any music from any time and any place. What did the listeners listening to music 150 years know? What was reflected in their music and their experience? The moment we know that, we have ownership. It's ours now. It belongs to me. If the composer's dead for 150 years, who cares? The music's alive. And the composer might as well be standing right next to us while we listen to it. So yeah, that's my gig, is to give us the same context historically that we have in our own music in our own time. So you were going to ask me what I'm doing.
Yes. What are you doing with all that knowledge and wonderfulness?
Well, since my gigs have all dried up, pain, agony, but no tears, no tears. You know, I'm on the site called Patreon, and for your listeners who don't know about it, I don't mean the plug, but I'm going to give myself the plug anyway. It was created by a guy named Jack Conte, who's a rock and roller, I don't know, about 15 years ago in San Francisco. He wanted a way to get his music out to a wider public online and still managed to generate some monetary return for it. So he created this company called Patreon, which allows folks to become patrons of a particular person or a particular band. And there's a lot of different models. You can give a dollar amount, $1, $2 every time this person puts out a song. In my case, you subscribe for as low as $2 a month, but I've got subscribers at $100 a month, and they get a lot of benefits. Although I'm not sure what benefits I could give for $100 a month. I've offered to give my children away. I've offered them the cat. But anyway, so it's a subscriber-based operation, and it's fantastic. And it's something that, of course, is growing by leaps and bounds during the pandemic, because it's another way for creators, not just musicians, but cartoonists and writers and poets, to reach an international public and to actually make some money off of it. Well, with the coming of the pandemic and the cancellation of all my gigs, I've just been putting most of my creative energy into Patreon. I used to post twice a week. Now I'm posting 5, even 6 times a week. Blogs, editorials, reviews, just all kinds of stuff. We're doing Zoom meetings. So that's how I'm spending about 60-70% of my time, is creating content for Patreon. It's a lot of work, but it allows my mind to range everywhere and allows me to go wherever I want to go. And then I'm composing the other 40% of the time. And once I finish a movement, I'm putting that movement up online to my patrons so they can hear what I'm doing, and I explain it as best I can. Then they can follow a score while the music is played, and they can ask me questions about it. And I can actually feel like I'm writing for an audience, which is great. And that's what the Patreon has given me. It has given me a sense of contact that I otherwise would absolutely not have during this time without it. And I don't know how anyone, especially someone who's a performer, something we talked about before, I don't know how anyone can survive without that. So luckily, that's my outlet. That's my audience right now.
Yeah.
When you explore all these different characters from the past, you've done a lot of different ways of examining, these, like, we have this idea of these stodgy, upright people who had no fun, but it turns out they're as scandalous as anybody else.
Oh, yeah.
And can you possibly get to everybody? And then when you find someone that you don't know very well, is it even work for you to go and dig in? Or is it just so much like, how was it like when you find someone that you didn't know about as much as before?
It happens all the time. Or someone with whom I had a passing familiarity, but never really thought about, or never understood. There are good things about getting older, very few. But the good things about getting older is unless we lose our marbles, we get smarter. We're always more prepared to deal with nuance. And I have found that as I get older, I get much more accepting, less parochial, less willing to criticize and more willing to enjoy. And so, for example, this week I've been writing about an English composer named Rafe Vaughan Williams. That first name is spelled Ralph, but we have to remember that it's only pronounced Ralph in the United States. Everywhere else, that spelling is pronounced Rafe. And he lived from 1882 to 1957, 58. And I've heard some of his stuff before, but I've really become enamored of his music just recently. I mean, crazy enamored, like going nuts enamored. And it's like discovering, it's like that dream you have where you discover a whole new wing on your house that you didn't know was there. All this great stuff, all this space. I didn't know I had a ballroom in my house. That's what it's like for me. And there's so much repertoire out there of every sort. Jazz, rock, hip hop, I mean, literate music, it's endless. And I find it's wonderful to keep discovering new stuff. So yeah, it happens to me all the time. It happens to me all the time. And it is work to delve into it, because if I'm writing, I have to write something coherent. And most of my blogs run about 1,500 to 2,000 words. So that's a full day's work. But this week I wrote about Vaughan Williams' Symphony No. 5. And I reviewed a number of recordings and recommended one. And I got to listen to this wonderful music over and over again. So this is all good. This is all good. And it's virtually unlimited, the amount of repertoire that's out there. You can never.
Well, I want to give our listeners a little taste, because Rafe Vaughan Williams, we talked a little earlier about how catastrophic events in history affect music, and his experience in World War I was he was a soldier. These are all things that you will learn, and Dr. Bob will anoint you if you go visit robertgreenbergmusic.com. But he was the kind of guy who lived through the World War, and it affected his music. And then later in his life, he had a scandalous affair with a younger woman, and that reinvigorated his music. And so he really was a rock star, and he had a rich life experience that informed what his creative output sounded like. And everybody, if you were interested in any of that, or if that intrigued you at all, including the scandalous part, then get to know Dr. Robert Greenberg's work.
She was 40 years younger than him.
Yeah.
And he was still married at the time, although his wife was ill. But it got to the point during World War II, because he also lived through World War II in London. And, you know, London, the Germans bombed the living daylights out of London.
Yeah.
So the girlfriend moved in with Rafe and his wife. And during air raids, they would sleep. Nice work
if you can get it, huh?
Yeah, tell me about it. During air raids, they would sleep in the same room in 3 beds next to each other, and they'd hold each other's hands. You know, and so when his wife finally passed away, he married this woman, Ursula, and he had her as his wife until the end of his life, and then she lived another 30 years. But listen, people are people. Yeah. It doesn't matter whether you're a composer or a rock and roller. People are people, and we're all given our estrogen and testosterone, and we're all motivated by a love of pleasure, a desire for respect, a desire for desire. Nothing changes. Our species is very predictable, and the way it manifests itself in someone's life and in their art is fascinating. But yeah, this whole powdered wig, this idolization, this here.
You can do it.
I did it. Okay. So I don't know if it's showing up.
Yeah.
That's supposed to be Beethoven. All right. Uh-huh. That looks way more like the actor Tyrone Power than Beethoven. This is the idolization of Beethoven, you know, the elevation of him to an iconic, a godlike status. Yeah. This beautiful man. If he looked like this, he would not have had the problems with women that he had. And boy, did he have problems with women. You know, they respected him as a musician, but they wouldn't for a second have shared his fluids. And that wasn't Beethoven. Beethoven was an unhappy, ugly little man who had a lot of monkeys on his shoulders. And brilliantly, wonderfully, and magnificently, he found a way to translate experience into this amazing music. But how can you understand the music without knowing about the person? right?
Right.
And people are people. And it's fascinating. And I most of my gig is just taking these dead people off their pedestals and presenting them as people like us, doing the things we do, but finding this universal musical voice that allows us to tap into their souls and experience. I think it's great fun.
Yeah, it
Well,
makes
and-
them infinitely more interesting, and it makes
And it makes-
their music gives them
right.
context.
Exactly. It makes the music more interesting, and it is great music. You know,
and thankfully, you're not just, digging up like I don't know, a few months back, they dug up Laura Ingalls Wilder, and called her a bigot and a monster and everything. And it's like, okay, great. But there's a whole lot more to know about a person than that. And, the reality is if you grew up on the prairie like she did, you probably would act exactly how she acted.
Everyone was a bigot and monster. Everyone is a bigot and a monster. Isn't it? It's terribly true. You know what we're seeing right now in my world? We're seeing this. The pendulum is swinging way too far. And where it's swinging is certain academics and certain people are saying that the entire Western canon of music and even music theory is inherently racist. It's racist for this reason, it's racist for that reason. All of these arguments. Okay, fine. Tell me something about the 19th century. Tell me something about the freaking 20th century that wasn't racist, that wasn't misogynist. Tell me something about today that isn't racist and misogynist. I'm sorry, people are not good all the time. People can be awful. What do we learn from that? Is the lesson that we're never supposed to listen to any of that music by dead Germans? Is the lesson that we're supposed to deny ourselves the art of Rembrandt and Renoir? I mean, are we supposed to not read Shakespeare? Excuse me. If we want to be literate human beings, we have to know our art because our art tells us who we are. Everything has to be understood in the context of its time. I'm not being an apologist. I'm being a realist. We live in a racist society. We're going to do what we can to overcome it. We've made a start, and hopefully on November 4th, we'll be able to take a bigger step. Excuse me for injecting politics momentarily. But it's a constant human struggle to see others to treat others as we would treat ourselves. That doesn't mean we have to flush out our art. It doesn't mean we have to deny any of us our essential humanity.
Yeah.
Okay, if someone wears a Nazi armband and is marching with tiki torches, okay, you're done. You're done with me. There aren't good people over there, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about the flaws we carry in us. And to the extent we can forgive those flaws, we should. But it seems to me we don't want to deny ourselves this man's experience because his experience can lighten our load and make our lives better. And anything that can make my life better,
take it.
I'm there, baby. I'm in. Yeah.
Well, listen,
Dr.
we had
Bob,
you
you
for an
make
hour.
our lives better. Yeah.
Thank you.
Go ahead,
Thank
John.
you.
I was just going to punctuate that point. You make our lives better. You make us smarter. We're going to encourage everybody, as always, to go visit robertgreenbergmusic.com, where, as it says down below, he'll enrich your life in ways you can't imagine. And in a lot of ways you can imagine and do. So it's a lot of fun. You'll find out things about the great composers that humanize them and that make the experience of literate music more enriching for all of you and all of us.
And hopefully, if I might add to that, break down the walls.
Yeah.
Because concert music or literate music or classical music is music.
Yes.
Just like people are people. It's popular music, this music, that music. Okay, I can tell you how we might distinguish between certain kinds of music. But the terms, they get in the way because they build walls. And we don't want the damned walls. And they're not necessary. Unless you're a total snob. I mean, there are people out there that my love of opera elevates me above the hoi polloi. And these are the people who hate what I do. And when I get hate mail, and I do, it's amazing. Even Mother Teresa probably got hate mail. because no matter what you do, you're going to piss somebody off. When I get hate mail, it's because I'm accused of being a lower middle class, which is true, a lower middle class person from Brooklyn, New York, and New Jersey, who is attempting to render high art common by using a common voice and blah, 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 blah. You know, it's the snobs who are pissed off at me by trying to make more user-friendly this wonderful music. If I was to respond to these idiots, which I don't, but if I was to respond to them, I would tell them that the people who actually write the music and the people who paint the paintings are part of the working class. They're not people like you. They're not snobbish. They're not rich. They're not endowed with high connoisseurship. They're working class people needing to make a living. Mozart would laugh his ass off if he heard someone talk that way. You can't make this wonderful art too accessible because it's supposed to be accessible. It's supposed to be for all of us. So there you have it. The people who don't like me, I'm glad they don't like me. I don't like them.
And I just want to say one thing real quick. Go in the other direction. If you feel like this kind of music is unattainable and you won't get it, listen to Bolero and let me know what happens 5 minutes after you turn it off. Because you'd be like, doo, 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 doo. Yeah. It'll stick to you, and you'll get it. You will get it. You will find something that you love in all of it. So, and we love you, Bob. This is so great to have you on again.
Thank
Not perfect as being in the same place, but we'll do that soon enough. As soon as
we'll do
it
it soon enough.
Also, I want to tell our listeners, if you knew the story of Dmitri Shostakovich, you might disagree with Dr. Bob's assessment that these composers weren't endowed, because he had something secret. Anyway.
Would you tell me?
You can find out more about that.
I want to find out more of it right now, John. Don't lead us on like that.
Yeah, well, just, we'll just use the word threesome and move on from there. Anyway, yeah, it's always a pleasure, Dr. Bob, to see you. Yeah. Did I get that right? That was Shostakovich, right? Who at one point lived in a functional threesome.
Yeah. He had affairs. He had an affair. He and his wife, Nina, were married young. She was beautiful. She was an athlete, and she was a chemist.
Yeah.
But then they had affairs, so they broke up, and then they remarried a year later, and then they stayed married until she died of cancer in 1954, I think it was, maybe 55. And then he remarried, and then divorced, and then remarried again to someone who was almost 30 years his junior. And
so he stayed busy.
Well, he says, I'm not the kind of guy who can just have casual affairs. I need a wife. And he did. He needed someone to take care of him. And this last wife, Irina, was a real gem. And she probably added 5 years to his life because of the support she gave him.
Yeah.
I love it.
So there you go. That's what you learn, everybody.
Well, people are people.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm going to sign off. Stand by.
Thank you, gentlemen.